There was also a mystery woman among them. They referred to her as Talia, the Nahual woman. Nobody told Don Juan who she was, or what being the Nahual woman meant. It was made clear to him, however, that one of the 7 women was Talia. They all talked so much about her that Don Juan's curiosity was aroused to tremendous heights. He asked so many questions that the woman who was the leader of the other women told him that she would teach him to read and write so that he might make better use of his deductive abilities. She said that he must learn to write things down rather than committing them to memory. In this fashion, he would accumulate a huge collection of facts about Talia, facts that he ought to read and study until the truth became evident. Perhaps anticipating the cynical retort he had in mind, she argued that although it might seem an absurd endeavor, finding out who Talia was one of the most difficult and rewarding tasks anyone could undertake. That, she said, was the fun part. She added more seriously that it was imperative for Don Juan to learn basic bookkeeping in order to help the Nahual manage the property. Immediately, she started daily lessons in 1 year, and in 1 year Don Juan had progressed so rapidly and extensively that he was able to read, write, and keep account books. Everything had occurred so smoothly that he did not notice the changes in himself, the most remarkable of which was a sense of detachment. As far as he was concerned, he retained his impression that nothing was happening in the house, simply because he still was unable to identify with the members of the household. Those people were mirrors that did not yield reflection. I took refuge in that house for nearly 3 years. Don Juan went on. Countless things happened to me during that time, but I didn't think they were really important. Or at least I had chosen to consider them unimportant. I was convinced that for 3 years all I had done was hide, shake with fear, and work like a mule. Don Juan laughed and told me that at one point, at the urging of the Nahual Julian, he agreed to learn sorcery so that he might rid himself of the fear that consumed him each time he saw the monster keeping vigil. But although the Nahual Julian talked to him a great deal, he seemed more interested in playing jokes on him. So he believed it was fair and accurate to say that he did not learn anything, even loosely related to sorcery, simply because it was apparent that nobody in that house knew or practiced sorcery. One day, however, he found himself walking purposefully, but without any volition on his part, toward the invisible line that held the monster at bay. The monstrous man was, of course, watching the house as usual. But that day, instead of turning back and running to seek shelter inside the house, Don Juan kept walking. An incredible surge of energy made him advance with no concern for his safety. A feeling of total detachment allowed him to face the monster that had terrorized him for so many years. Don Juan expected the monster to lurch out and grab him by the throat. But that thought no longer created any terror in him. From a distance of a few inches, he stared at the monstrous man for an instant and then stepped over the line. And the monster did not attack him, as Don Juan had always feared he would, but became blurry. He lost his definition and turned into a misty whiteness, a barely perceptible patch of fog. Don Juan advanced toward the fog, and it receded as if in fear. He chased the patch of fog over the fields until he knew there was nothing left of the monster. He knew then that there had never been one. He could not, however, explain what he had feared. He had the vague sensation that although he knew exactly what the monster was, something was preventing him from thinking about it. He immediately thought that that rascal, the Nahual Julian, knew the truth about what was happening. Don Juan would not have put it past the Nahual Julian to play that kind of trick. Before confronting him, Don Juan gave himself the pleasure of walking unescorted all over the property. Never before had he been able to do that. Whenever he had needed to venture beyond that invisible line, he had been escorted by a member of the household. That had put a serious constraint on his mobility. The 2 or 3 times he had attempted to walk unescorted, he had found that he risked annihilation at the hands of the monstrous being. Filled with a strange vigor, Don Juan went into the house. But instead of celebrating his new freedom and power, he assembled the entire household and angrily demanded that they explain their lies. He accused them of making him work as their slave by playing on his fear of a non-existent monster. The women laughed as if he were telling the funniest joke. Only the Nahual Julian seemed contrite, especially when Don Juan, his voice cracking with resentment, described his 3 years of constant fear. The Nahual Julian broke down and wept openly as Don Juan demanded an apology for the shameful way he had been exploited. "But we told you the monster didn't exist," one of the women said. Don Juan glared at the Nahual Julian, who cowered meekly. "He knew the monster existed," Don Juan yelled, pointing an accusing finger at the Nahual. But at the same time, he was aware he was talking nonsense, because the Nahual Julian had originally told him that the monster did not exist. "The monster didn't exist," Don Juan corrected himself, shaking with rage. "It was one of his tricks." The Nahual Julian, weeping uncontrollably, apologized to Don Juan, while the women howled with laughter. Don Juan had never seen them laughing so hard. "You knew all along that there was never any monster. You lied to me," he accused the Nahual Julian, who, with his head down and his eyes filled with tears, admitted his guilt. "I have certainly lied to you," he mumbled. "There was never any monster. What you saw as a monster was simply a surge of energy. Your fear made it into a monstrosity. You told me that the monster was going to devour me. How could you have lied to me like that?" Don Juan shouted at him. "Being devoured by that monster was symbolic," the Nahual Julian replied softly. "Your real enemy is your stupidity. You are in mortal danger of being devoured by that monster now." Don Juan yelled that he did not have to put up with silly statements, and he insisted they reassure him there were no longer any restrictions on his freedom to leave. "You can go any time you want," the Nahual Julian said curtly. "You mean I can go right now?" Don Juan asked. "Do you want to?" the Nawal asked. Of course. I want to leave this miserable place. And this miserable bunch of liars who live here, Don Juan shouted. The Nawal Julian ordered that Don Juan's savings be paid him in full, and with shining eyes wished him happiness, prosperity, and wisdom. The women did not want to say goodbye to him. They stared at him until he lowered his head to avoid their burning eyes. Don Juan put his money in his pocket and without a backward glance walked out, glad his ordeal was over. The outside world was a question mark to him. He yearned for it. Inside that house, he had been removed from it. He was young, strong. He had money in his pocket and a thirst for living. He left them without saying thank you. His anger, bottled up by his fear for so long, was finally able to surface. He had even learned to like them, and now he felt betrayed. He wanted to run as far away from that place as he could. In the city, he had his first unpleasant encounter. Traveling was very difficult and very expensive. He learned that if he wanted to leave the city at once, he would not be able to choose his destination, but would have to wait for whatever muleteers were willing to take him. A few days later, he left with a reputable muleteer for the port of Mazatlan. Although I was only 23 years old at the time, Don Juan said, I felt I had lived a full life. The only thing I had not experienced was sex. The Nawal Julian had told me that it was the fact I had not been with a woman that gave me my strength and endurance, and that he had little time left to set things up before the world would catch up with me. What did he mean, Don Juan? I asked. He meant that I had no idea about the kind of hell I was heading for, Don Juan replied, and that he had very little time to set up my barricades, my silent protectors. What's a silent protector, Don Juan? I asked. It's a lifesaver, he said. A silent protector is a surge of an inexplicable energy that comes to a warrior when nothing else works. My benefactor knew what direction my life would take once I was no longer under his influence, so he struggled to give me as many sorcery options as possible. Those sorcerer's options were to be my silent protectors. What are sorcerer's options? I asked. Positions of the assemblage point, he replied. The infinite number of positions which the assemblage point can reach. In each and every one of those shallow or deep shifts, a sorcerer can strengthen his new continuity. He reiterated that everything he had experienced, either with his benefactor or while under his guidance, had been the result of either a minute or a considerable shift of his assemblage point. His benefactor had made him experience countless sorcerer's options, more than the number that would normally be necessary, because he knew that Don Juan's destiny would be to be called upon to explain what sorcerers were and what they did. The effects of those shifts of the assemblage point is cumulative, he continued. It weighs on you whether you understand it or not. That accumulation worked for me at the end. Very soon after I came into contact with the Nawal, my point of assemblage moved so profoundly that I was capable of seeing. I saw an energy field as a monster. And the point kept on moving until I saw the monster as what it really was, an energy field. I had succeeded in seeing, and I didn't know it. I thought I had done nothing, had learned nothing. I was stupid beyond belief. "You were too young, Don Juan," I said. "You couldn't have done otherwise." He laughed. He was on the verge of replying when he seemed to change his mind. He shrugged his shoulders and went on with his account. Don Juan said that when he arrived in Mazatlan, he was practically a seasoned muleteer and was offered a permanent job running a mule train. He was very satisfied with the arrangements. The idea that he would be making the trip between Durango and Mazatlan pleased him no end. There were two things, however, that bothered him. First, that he had not yet been with a woman. And second, a strong but unexplainable urge to go north. He did not know why. He knew only that somewhere to the north, something was waiting for him. The feeling persisted so strongly that in the end he was forced to refuse the security of a permanent job so he could travel north. His superior strength and a new and unaccountable cunning enabled him to find jobs even where there were none to be had. As he steadily worked his way north to the state of Sinaloa. And there his journey ended. He met a young widow, like himself a Yaqui Indian, who had been the wife of a man to whom Don Juan was indebted. He attempted to repay his indebtedness by helping the widow and her children. And without being aware of it, he fell into the role of husband and father. His new responsibilities put a great burden on him. He lost his freedom of movement and even his urge to journey farther north. He felt compensated for that loss, however, by the profound affection he felt for the woman and her children. I experienced moments of sublime happiness as a husband and father, Don Juan said. But it was at those moments when I first noticed that something was terribly wrong. I realized that I was losing the feeling of detachment, the aloofness I had acquired during my time in the Nahual Julian's house. Now, I found myself identifying with the people who surrounded me. Don Juan said that it took about a year of unrelenting abrasion to make him lose every vestige of the new personality he had acquired at the Nahual's house. He had begun with a profound yet aloof affection for the woman and her children. This detached affection allowed him to play the role of husband and father with abandon and gusto. As time went by, his detached affection turned into a desperate passion that made him lose his effectiveness. Gone was his feeling of detachment, which was what had given him the power to love. Without that detachment, he had only mundane needs, desperation, and hopelessness, the distinctive features of the world of everyday life. Gone as well was his enterprise. During his years at the Nahual's house, he had acquired a dynamism that had served him well when he set out on his own. But the most draining pain was knowing that his physical energy had waned. without actually being in ill health. One day he became totally paralyzed. He did not feel pain. He did not panic. It was as if his body had understood that he would get the peace and quiet he so desperately needed only if it ceased to move. As he lay helpless in bed, he did nothing but think. And he came to realize that he had failed because he did not have an abstract purpose. He knew that the people in the Nahual's house were extraordinary because they pursued freedom as their abstract purpose. He did not understand what freedom was, but he knew that it was the opposite of his own concrete needs. His lack of an abstract purpose had made him so weak and ineffective that he was incapable of rescuing his adopted family from their abysmal poverty. Instead, they had pulled him back to the very misery, sadness, and despair which he himself had known prior to encountering the Nahual. As he reviewed his life, he became aware that the only time he had not been poor and had not had concrete needs was during his years with the Nahual. Poverty was the state of being that had reclaimed him when his concrete needs overpowered him. For the first time since he had been shot and wounded so many years before, Don Juan fully understood that the Nahual Julian was indeed the Nahual, the leader, and his benefactor. He understood what it was his benefactor had meant when he said to him that there was no freedom without the Nahual's intervention. There was now no doubt in Don Juan's mind that his benefactor and all the members of his benefactor's household were sorcerers. But what Don Juan understood with the most painful clarity was that he had thrown away his chance to be with them. When the pressure of his physical helplessness seemed unendurable, his paralysis ended as mysteriously as it had begun. One day he simply got out of bed and went to work. But his luck did not get any better. He could hardly make ends meet. Another year passed. He did not prosper, but there was one thing in which he succeeded beyond his expectations. He made a total recapitulation of his life. He understood then why he loved and could not leave those children, and why he could not stay with them. And he also understood why he could neither act one way nor the other. Don Juan knew that he had reached a complete impasse, and that to die like a warrior was the only action congruous with what he had learned at his benefactor's house. So every night, after a frustrating day of hardship and meaningless toil, he patiently waited for his death to come. He was so utterly convinced of his end that his wife and her children waited with him. In a gesture of solidarity, they too wanted to die. All four sat in perfect immobility, night after night, without fail, and recapitulated their lives while they waited for death. Don Juan had admonished them with the same words his benefactor had used to admonish him. "Don't wish for it," his benefactor had said. Just wait until it comes. Don't try to imagine what death is like. Just be there to be caught in its flow. The time spent quietly strengthened them mentally, but physically their emaciated bodies told of their losing battle. One day, however, Don Juan thought his luck was beginning to change. He found temporary work with a team of farm laborers during the harvest season. But the spirit had other designs for him. A couple of days after he started to work, someone stole his hat. It was impossible for him to buy a new one, but he had to have one to work under the scorching sun. He fashioned a protection of sorts by covering his head with rags and handfuls of straw. His co-workers began to laugh and taunt him. He ignored them. Compared to the lives of the 3 people who depended on his labor, how he looked had little meaning for him. But the men did not stop. They yelled and laughed until the foreman, fearing that they would riot, fired Don Juan. A wild rage overwhelmed Don Juan's sense of sobriety and caution. He knew he had been wronged. The moral right was with him. He let out a chilling, piercing scream and grabbed one of the men and lifted him over his shoulders, meaning to crack his back. But he thought of those hungry children. He thought of their disciplined little bodies as they sat with him night after night, awaiting death. He put the man down and walked away. Don Juan said that he sat down at the edge of the field where the men were working, and all the despair that had accumulated in him finally exploded. It was a silent rage, but not against the people around him. He raged against himself. He raged until all his anger was spent. I sat there in view of all those people and began to weep. Don Juan continued. They looked at me as if I were crazy, which I really was, but I didn't care. I was beyond caring. The foreman felt sorry for me and came over to give a word of advice. He thought I was weeping for myself. He couldn't have possibly known that I was weeping for the spirit. Don Juan said that a silent protector came to him after his rage was spent. It was in the form of an unaccountable surge of energy that left him with the clear feeling that his death was imminent. He knew that he was not going to have time to see his adopted family again. He apologized to them in a loud voice for not having had the fortitude and wisdom necessary to deliver them from their hell on earth. The farm workers continued to laugh and mock him. He vaguely heard them. Tears swelled in his chest as he addressed and thanked the spirit for having placed him in the Nahual's path, giving him an undeserved chance to be free. He heard the howls of the uncomprehending men. He heard their insults and yells as if from within himself. They had the right to ridicule him. He had been at the portals of eternity and had been unaware of it. I understood how right my benefactor had been, Don Juan said. My stupidity was a monster, and it had already devoured me. The instant I had that thought, I knew that anything I could say or do was useless. I had lost my chance. Now, I was only clowning for those men. The spirit could not possibly have cared about my despair. There were too many of us, men with our own petty private hells, born of our stupidity, for the spirit to pay attention. I knelt and faced the southeast. I thanked my benefactor again and told the spirit I was ashamed, so ashamed. And with my last breath, I said goodbye to a world which could have been wonderful if I had had wisdom. An immense wave came for me then. I felt it first. Then I heard it. And finally I saw it coming for me from the southeast, over the fields. It overtook me, and its blackness covered me. And the light of my life was gone. My hell had ended. I was finally dead. I was finally free. Don Juan's story devastated me. He ignored all my efforts to talk about it. He said that at another time and in another setting, we were going to discuss it. He demanded instead that we get on with what he had come to do. Elucidate the mastery of awareness. A couple of days later, as we were coming down from the mountains, he suddenly began to talk about his story. We had sat down to rest. Actually, I was the one who had stopped to catch my breath. Don Juan was not even breathing hard. The sorcerer's struggle for assuredness is the most dramatic struggle there is, Don Juan said. It's painful and costly. Many, many times it has actually cost sorcerers their lives. He explained that in order for any sorcerer to have complete certainty about his actions, or about his position in the sorcerer's world, or to be capable of utilizing intelligently his new continuity, he must invalidate the continuity of his old life. Only then can his actions have the necessary assuredness to fortify and balance the tenuousness and instability of his new continuity. The sorcerer-seers of modern times call this process of invalidation the ticket to impeccability, or the sorcerer's symbolic but final death, Don Juan said. And in that field in Sinaloa, I got my ticket to impeccability. I died there. The tenuousness of my new continuity cost me my life. But did you die, Don Juan? Or did you just faint? I asked, trying not to sound cynical. I died in that field, he said. I felt my awareness flowing out of me and heading toward the eagle. But as I had impeccably recapitulated my life, the eagle did not swallow my awareness. The eagle spat me out. Because my body was dead in the field, the eagle did not let me go through to freedom. It was as if it told me to go back and try again. I ascended the heights of blackness and descended again to the light of the earth. And then I found myself in a shallow grave at the edge of the field, covered with rocks and dirt. Don Juan said that he knew instantly what to do. After digging himself out, he rearranged the grave to look as if a body were still there, and slipped away. He felt strong and determined. He knew that he had to return to his benefactor's house. But before he started on his return journey, he wanted to see his family and explain to them that he was a sorcerer, and for that reason he could not stay with them. He wanted to explain that his downfall had been not knowing that sorcerers can never make a bridge to join the people of the world. But if people desire to do so, they have to make a bridge to join sorcerers. I went home, Don Juan continued, but the house was empty. The shocked neighbors told me that the farm workers had come earlier with the news that I had dropped dead at work, and my wife and her children had left. "How long were you dead, Don Juan?" I asked. "A whole day, apparently," he said. Don Juan's smile played on his lips. His eyes seemed to be made of shiny obsidian. He was watching my reaction, waiting for my comments. "What became of your family, Don Juan?" I asked. "Ah, the question of a sensible man," he remarked. "For a moment I thought you were going to ask me about my death." I confessed that I had been about to, but that I knew he was seeing my question as I formulated it in my mind. And just to be contrary, I asked him something else. I did not mean it as a joke, but it made him laugh. "My family disappeared that day," he said. "My wife was a survivor. She had to be, with the conditions we lived under. Since I had been waiting for my death, she believed I had gotten what I wanted. There was nothing for her to do there, so she left. I missed the children, and I consoled myself with the thought that it wasn't my fate to be with them. However, sorcerers have a peculiar bent. They live exclusively in the twilight of a feeling best described by the words, 'and yet.' When everything is crumbling down around them, sorcerers accept that the situation is terrible, and then immediately escape to the twilight of 'and yet.' I did that with my feelings for those children and the woman. With great discipline, especially on the part of the oldest boy, they had recapitulated their lives with me. Only the Spirit could decide the outcome of that affection. He reminded me that he had taught me how warriors acted in such situations. They did their utmost, and then, without any remorse or regrets, they relaxed and let the Spirit decide the outcome. "What was the decision of the Spirit, Don Juan?" I asked. He scrutinized me without answering. I knew he was completely aware of my motive for asking. I had experienced a similar affection and a similar loss. "The decision of the Spirit is another basic core," he said. "Sorcerer stories are built around it. We'll talk about that specific decision when we get to discussing that basic core. Now, wasn't there a question about my death you wanted to ask? If they thought you were dead, why the shallow grave?" I asked. "Why didn't they dig a real grave and bury you?" "That's more like you," he said, laughing. I asked the same question myself, and I realized that all those farm workers were pious people. I was a Christian. Christians are not buried just like that, nor are they left to rot like dogs. I think they were waiting for my family to come and claim the body and give it a proper burial. But my family never came. Did you go and look for them, Don Juan? I asked. No, sorcerers never look for anyone, he replied. And I was a sorcerer. I had paid with my life for the mistake of not knowing I was a sorcerer, and that sorcerers never approach anyone. From that day on, I have only accepted the company or the care of people or warriors who are dead, as I am. Don Juan said that he went back to his benefactor's house, where all of them knew instantly what he had discovered, and they treated him as if he had not left at all. The Nahual Julian commented that because of his peculiar nature, Don Juan had taken a long time to die. My benefactor told me then that a sorcerer's ticket to freedom was his death. Don Juan went on. He said that he himself had paid with his life for that ticket to freedom, as had everyone else in his household, and that now we were equals in our condition of being dead. Am I dead too, Don Juan? I asked. You are dead, he said. The sorcerer's grand trick, however, is to be aware that they are dead. Their ticket to impeccability must be wrapped in awareness. In that wrapping, sorcerers say, their ticket is kept in mint condition. For 60 years, I have kept mine in mint condition. Chapter 6a, Handling Intent. The third point. Don Juan often took me and the rest of his apprentices on short trips to the western range nearby. On this occasion we left at dawn, and late in the afternoon started back. I chose to walk with Don Juan. To be close to him always soothed me and relaxed me, but being with his volatile apprentices always produced in me the opposite effect. They made me feel very tired. As we all came down from the mountains, Don Juan and I made one stop before we reached the flatlands. An attack of profound melancholy came upon me with such speed and strength that all I could do was sit down. Then, following Don Juan's suggestion, I lay on my stomach on top of a large, round boulder. The rest of the apprentices taunted me and continued walking. I heard their laughter and yelling become faint in the distance. Don Juan urged me to relax and let my assemblage point, which he said had moved with sudden speed, settle into its new position. Don't fret, he advised me. In a short while, you'll feel a sort of tug or a pat on your back, as if someone had touched you. Then you'll be fine. The act of laying motionless on the boulder, waiting to feel the pat on my back, triggered a spontaneous recollection so intense and clear that I never noticed the pat I was expecting. I was sure, however, that I got it, because my melancholy indeed vanished instantly. I quickly described what I was recollecting to Don Juan. He suggested I stay on the boulder and move my assemblage point back to the exact place it was when I experienced the event that I was recalling. Get every detail of it, he warned. It had happened many years before. Don Juan and I had been at that time in the state of Chihuahua, in northern Mexico, in the high desert. I used to go there with him because it was an area rich in the medicinal herbs he collected. From an anthropological point of view, that area also held a tremendous interest for me. Archaeologists had found, not too long before, the remains of what they concluded was a large prehistoric trading post. They surmised that the trading post, strategically situated in a natural passway, had been the epicenter of commerce along a trade route which joined the American Southwest to southern Mexico and central Mexico. The few times I had been in that flat, high desert had reinforced my conviction that archaeologists were right in their conclusions, that it was a natural passway. I, of course, had lectured Don Juan on the influence of that passway in the prehistoric distribution of cultural traits on the North American continent. I was deeply interested at that time in explaining sorcery among the Indians of the American Southwest, Mexico, and Central America as a system of beliefs which had been transmitted along trade routes and which had served to create, at a certain abstract level, a sort of pre-Columbian pan-Indianism. Don Juan naturally laughed uproariously every time I expounded my theories. The event that I had recollected had begun in the mid-afternoon. After Don Juan and I had gathered 2 small sacks of some extremely rare medicinal herbs, we took a break and sat down on top of some huge boulders. But before we headed back to where I had left my car, Don Juan insisted on talking about the art of stalking. He said that the setting was the most adequate one for explaining its intricacies, but that in order to understand them, I first had to enter into heightened awareness. I demanded that before he do anything, he explain to me again what heightened awareness really was. Don Juan, displaying great patience, discussed heightened awareness in terms of the movement of the assemblage point. As he kept talking, I realized the facetiousness of my request. I knew everything he was telling me. I remarked that I did not really need anything explained, and he said that explanations were never wasted because they were imprinted in us for immediate or later use, or to help prepare our way to reaching silent knowledge. When I asked him to talk about silent knowledge in more detail, he quickly responded that silent knowledge was a general position of the assemblage point, that ages ago it had been man's normal position, but that for reasons which would be impossible to determine, man's assemblage point had moved away from that specific location and adopted a new one called reason. Don Juan remarked that not every human being was a representative of this new position. The assemblage points of the majority of us were not placed squarely on the location of reason itself, but in its immediate vicinity. The same thing had been the case with silent knowledge. Not every human being's assemblage point had been squarely on that location either. He also said that the place of no pity, being another position of the assemblage point, was the forerunner of silent knowledge, and that yet another position of the assemblage point, called the place of concern, was the forerunner of reason. I found nothing obscure about those cryptic remarks. To me, they were self-explanatory. I understood everything he said while I waited for his usual blow to my shoulder blades to make me enter into heightened awareness. But the blow never came, and I kept on understanding what he was saying without really being aware that I understood anything. The feeling of ease, of taking things for granted, proper to my normal consciousness, remained with me, and I did not question my capacity to understand. Don Juan looked at me fixedly and recommended that I lie face down on top of a round boulder with my arms and legs spread like a frog. I lay there for about 10 minutes, thoroughly relaxed, almost asleep, until I was jolted out of my slumber by a soft, sustained, hissing growl. I raised my head, looked up, and my hair stood on end. A gigantic dark jaguar was squatting on a boulder, scarcely 10 feet from me, right above where Don Juan was sitting. The jaguar, its fangs showing, was glaring straight at me. He seemed ready to jump on me. "Don't move," Don Juan ordered me softly. "And don't look at his eyes. Stare at his nose and don't blink. Your life depends on your stare." I did what he told me. The jaguar and I stared at each other for a moment until Don Juan broke the standoff by hurling his hat like a frisbee at the jaguar's head. The jaguar jumped back to avoid being hit, and Don Juan let out a loud, prolonged, and piercing whistle. He then yelled at the top of his voice and clapped his hands 2 or 3 times. It sounded like muffled gunshots. Don Juan signaled me to come down from the boulder and join him. The two of us yelled and clapped our hands until he decided we had scared the jaguar away. My body was shaking, yet I was not frightened. I told Don Juan that what had caused me the greatest fear had not been the cat's sudden growl or his stare, but the certainty that the jaguar had been staring at me long before I had heard him and lifted my head. Don Juan did not say a word about the experience. He was in deep thought. When I began to ask him if he had seen the jaguar before I had, he made an imperious gesture to quiet me. He gave me the impression he was ill at ease, or even confused. After a moment's silence, Don Juan signaled me to start walking. He took the lead. We walked away from the rocks, zigzagging at a fast pace through the bush. After about a half an hour, we reached a clearing in the chaparral where we stopped to rest for a moment. We had not said a single word, and I was eager to know what Don Juan was thinking. "Why are we walking in this pattern?" I asked. "Wouldn't it be better to make a beeline out of here, and fast?" "No," he said emphatically. "It wouldn't be any good. That one is a male jaguar. He's hungry, and he's going to come after us." "All the more reason to get out of here fast," I insisted. "It's not so easy," he said. "That jaguar is not encumbered by reason. He'll know exactly what to do to get us. And as sure as I am talking to you, he'll read our thoughts." "What do you mean, the jaguar reading our thoughts?" I asked. That is no metaphorical statement, he said. I mean what I say. Big animals like that have the capacity to read thoughts. And I don't mean guess. I mean that they know everything directly. What can we do then? I asked, truly alarmed. We ought to become less rational and try to win the battle by making it impossible for the jaguar to read us, he replied. How would being less rational help us? I asked. Reason makes us choose what seems sound to the mind, he said. For instance, your reason already told you to run as fast as you can in a straight line. What your reason failed to consider is that we would have to run about 6 miles before reaching the safety of your car. And the jaguar will outrun us. He'll cut in front of us and be waiting in the most appropriate place to jump us. A better but less rational choice is to zigzag. How do you know that it's better, Don Juan? I asked. I know it because my connection to the spirit is very clear, he replied. That is to say, my assemblage point is at the place of silent knowledge. From there, I can discern that this is a hungry jaguar, but not one that has already eaten humans, and he's baffled by our actions. If we zigzag now, the jaguar will have to make an effort to anticipate us. Are there any other choices besides zigzagging? I asked. There are only rational choices, he said, and we don't have all the equipment we need to back up rational choices. For example, we can head for the high ground, but we would need a gun to hold it. We must match the jaguar's choices. Those choices are dictated by silent knowledge. We must do what silent knowledge tells us, regardless of how unreasonable it may seem. He began his zigzagging trot. I followed him very closely, but I had no confidence that running like that would save us. I was having a delayed panic reaction. The thought of the dark, looming shape of the enormous cat obsessed me. The desert chaparral consisted of tall, ragged bushes spaced 4 or 5 feet apart. The limited rainfall in the high desert did not allow the growth of plants with thick foliage or of dense underbrush. Yet the visual effect of the chaparral was of thickness and impenetrable growth. Don Juan moved with extraordinary nimbleness, and I followed as best as I could. He suggested that I watch where I stepped and make less noise. He said that the sound of branches cracking under my weight was a dead giveaway. I deliberately tried to step in Don Juan's tracks to avoid breaking dry branches. We zigzagged about 100 yards in this manner before I caught sight of the jaguar's enormous dark mass, no more than 30 feet behind me. I yelled at the top of my voice. Without stopping, Don Juan turned around quickly enough to see the big cat move out of sight. Don Juan let out another piercing whistle and kept clapping his hands, imitating the sound of muffled gunshots. In a very low voice he said that cats did not like to go uphill, and so we were going to cross, at top speed, the wide and deep ravine a few yards to my right. He gave a signal to go, and we thrashed through the bushes as fast as we could We slid down one side of the ravine, reached the bottom, and rushed up the other side. From there, we had a clear view of the slope, the bottom of the ravine, and the level ground where we had been. Don Juan whispered that the jaguar was following our scent, and that if we were lucky, we would see him running to the bottom of the ravine, close to our tracks. Gazing fixedly at the ravine below us, I waited anxiously to catch a glimpse of the animal, but I did not see him. I was beginning to think that the jaguar might have run away when I heard the frightening growling of the big cat in the chaparral just behind us. I had the chilling realization that Don Juan had been right. To get to where he was, the jaguar must have read our thoughts and crossed the ravine before we had. Without uttering a single word, Don Juan began running at a formidable speed. I followed, and we zigzagged for quite a while. I was totally out of breath when we stopped to rest. The fear of being chased by the jaguar had not, however, prevented me from admiring Don Juan's superb physical prowess. He had run as if he were a young man. I began to tell him that he had reminded me of someone in my childhood who had impressed me deeply with his running ability. But he signaled me to stop talking. He listened attentively, and so did I. I heard a soft rustling in the underbrush right ahead of us, and then the black silhouette of the jaguar was visible for an instant at a spot in the chaparral, perhaps 50 yards from us. Don Juan shrugged his shoulders and pointed in the direction of the animal. "It looks like we're not going to shake him off," he said, with a tone of resignation. "Let's walk calmly, as if we were taking a nice stroll in the park. And you tell me the story of your childhood. This is the right time and the right setting for it. A jaguar is after us with a ravenous appetite, and you are reminiscing about your past. The perfect not doing for being chased by a jaguar."